before I even say hello, I need to know this. I wouldn't even say we're having a debate in the TIR private chat, but your burrito, do you like rice and beans in it? Or do you just like it straight meat? I do not like all that bullshit in my burrito. Because a real burrito doesn't have all that bullshit in it. I need to know. Leave your answer in the comments. Greetings. I'm your host, Jason Miles, and welcome to another episode of this Revolution podcast. For all the returning listeners and subscribers, and of course, our very valued patrons, thank you so much for coming back. To those new to the channel, thank you for taking a moment to check us out. If you dig what we're doing, please hit the like and, of course, subscribe. It goes a long way in promoting the channel. I was recently a guest on the Unaligned podcast on Substack, where we discussed my guest essay that was up there, Mob Rules, Celebrity Culture, Criminal Justice, and Housing Policy in a Milieu of Callousness. I did put a link up to that essay and that appearance, so wherever you are watching or listening to the show, you'll be able to find it in the description. Also, if you're a patron here on TIR, I put up the unedited version. Text-only version is free for all patrons, and the magazine layout version is up as well. Again, wherever you are watching or listening to this, there's a link in the description to the crisis papers that you can only get at TIR. Also, we are listener funded here on TIR. And as you know from the last show that we did Tuesday, even when we're being serious, the uncensored nature of the show often causes demonetization. That being said, if you have the means and feel so inclined, want to support what we do here on TIR, become a patron for as little as $3 a month or $30 for the year. You can have access to our patron-only call-in shows, of course, the uncensored champagne rooms, and whenever we effing get around to it, movie night. So wherever you're watching or listening, there's a link in the description to the Patreon as well. Now, with that out of the way, let's get into why you guys are here. Our guest today, Professor Dr. Alexander Herbert. Tariffs, trade deficit, budget deficits, what does it all mean? Well, friend of show and Professor Alexander Herbert wants to teach you what political economy is. So please welcome Professor Alexander Herbert.
Yeah, the crowd. Yeah, they do the Nixon thing.
You're a vegetarian, so you probably want all the stuff in your burrito. So you're not.
I was going to answer your question and say,
no,
I need those things in my burrito. Otherwise, there's nothing.
Yeah, that question is not for vegetarians because they don't count.
And I will admit, when I was in Mexico visiting you, and I asked people for beans and rice, they looked at me like I had 8 heads. They were like,
"Yeah,
gay?
Yeah, fuck out of here! Get out of here! Scram!
Yeah,
we don't need you. We don't need your."
So I concede. You know, my burrito. If we're sticking culturally, my burrito is abnormal, and I'll concede that. That's fine.
I mean, the American burrito is a very large, especially California, and depending on where in California you are, there's going to be different things in it. It's going to look a little different. But when you're in Mexico, they definitely look really different.
Oh yeah, when you start getting French fries in your burrito, you know you're somewhere weird. Like you're in California, like it's strange.
We were on tour years ago, and just in San Diego, and someone in the group was like, "Oh, our drummer is from your hood. He's from the New England area." And he was like, "Oh, there's a place where you get hot Cheetos in your burrito." I was like, "That sounds stupid. No one would do that." And sure enough, right by the venue we played was a place that put, hot Cheetos in the burrito. I was like, fucking A, dude. No one should ever do this to food.
Yeah, I've seen videos of people that bring like their own chip to like a food truck, and they're like, "I want a bowl with this," and the food truck takes the bag, dumps the bag into a bowl, and they put shit on top of it.
It's
It's like make your own, bring your own almost. I don't know.
Just fucking go to your own kitchen. Well, look, Alex, you have a class about political economy. Before we even get into what you talk about, can you first explain what political economy is?
Yeah. So, well, I mean, it's going to take at least 4 classes for me to really explain what political economy is. But what I can do instead of providing a definitive definition is I can give you some key questions and points. I mean, for me, for my mind, political economy is concerned with how the production, distribution, and consumption of goods and money affects political and social formations. Full stop. That's sort of a definition that I would put on it. And another definition is not so much a definitive definition, but a question. The question that's at the heart of political economy, which is how people used to refer to economics. And there is a difference. Political economy is concerned with, again, the political and social dynamics of economics and the historical, I would say. And economics itself, as it sort of morphed in the 19th century, became strictly concerned with econometrics and mathematical equations, and et cetera, et cetera. But the question that's at the heart of all of this is an important one to think about. I want to do a thought experiment with you. Is how do we, as a society, distribute finite goods when there is infinite demand? So the thought experiment that I want to do is imagine you, Jason, are the king of the world.
Jesus.
And you want to make your people happy, right? You want to stay king of the world. And so the question is, how do you make sure that the distribution of goods or wealth or whatever you want in your kingdom is equitable? And the understanding that the number of goods, the amount of wealth is finite. It's not infinite, right? There's a limited amount of wealth. How do you distribute it in a way that's going to make everybody happy? And that's sort of the question that's at the heart of political economy. Is that once an economic question, but it's also fundamentally a moral question. It's a question of morality. How do we distribute these things? That's the definition that I would give to political economy. It's a combination of a question and a statement, I guess.
So you're asking me how I would do that?
Yeah. How would you do that?
How would I distribute the stuff? Oh man. Are we talking just like food? Is this generic stuff, widgets, if you will?
Yeah, let's think about food. Let's think about necessities of life, I guess.
I guess I go hungriest first, and distribute from there. See who was the hungriest. I don't know. That's just a trick question that I was not prepared to ask.
It's not a trick question. It's a question that people have been contemplating for a very long time. And it's the question that's at the heart of both economics today and political economy of the past. And so the class that I'm offering, it's a fully online class. There are going to be 5 meetings. Each meeting is going to be 2 hours long. Half of that is going to be lecture with a full presentation and some historical context and a discussion about specific schools as they emerged. And the other half of that is going to be group discussion about shared readings so that we can firmly get the ideas of, let's say, the Austrian School of Economics in our minds, and so that we can move forward with them and to help us understand the way that, for example, Jerome Powell talks about lowering interest rates, right? What does that mean? A lot of people don't even know what that means. Or as you said, deficits, right? These big words that we hear, the S&P 500, a lot of words that people hear that they really don't understand. Maybe they have some notion of it, right? They know that if the S&P is up, that's good. If it's down, that's bad. But on a more fundamental level, as it's related to this question of distribution, consumption, and production. How is it related? And that's sort of the heart of political economy. That's the purpose of the class that I'm offering.
So how do you distribute everything to your kingdom?
There's no definite answer. I mean, so the way that the class is structured is every meeting we're going to cover about one or two schools of economic thought, beginning with what's called the classical school of political economy. This is what most of your listeners are probably exposed to in their American history class, people like Adam Smith, David Ricardo, John Stuart Mill, for example. These are the sort of progenitors of the question: how do you distribute finite goods when in a context of infinite demand, right? And what they are experiencing is the sort of emergence of an altogether new world, right? And I mean new world in the sense that literally their political entities, their nation states, their empires are discovering the new world. They're bringing in massive amounts of wealth that they're extracting from that new world. And then the question becomes, what do we do with all this wealth now? And not only that, but the way that the wealth is distributing itself in places like England, Spain, and in France is clearly there's some people who are benefiting from this more than others. And so the question becomes, well, how do we do that equally? How do we create a system where there aren't any market failures, right? People know Adam Smith is the guy that mentioned the phrase invisible hand for the first time. The classical school is big on the sort of free market, which is tied to this idea of liberalism. But then again, by the middle of the 19th century, you had a series of revolutions throughout Europe in 1848, right? It's the same year that John Stuart Mill publishes his biggest work on political economy. And it's the same year that Marx publishes the Communist Manifesto, 1848. And 1848 was a uprising of in a sense, the proto-working class, you can call it. So both Marx and Mill are responding to what's going on, right? We have this robust industrial economy that's emerging. We have more wealth than we've ever had, in European history. And yet there are people that don't have houses. There are people that can't afford their day-to-day living. What's going on? And that's the question that's at the heart of political economy. How can we get this system to work? And so this is the kind of series, the historical context, and the key ideas that we'll be going through in the class.
Sorry. Do you want to explain kind of a little bit about, because I think even if we're going to talk about what your class is, I have watched numerous shows about tariffs, and it's even a part of the daily conversation now when I go pick up my mail. Can you explain a little bit about the history of tariffs, or is that and income taxes, or is that too much?
Yeah, we can get into the history of tariffs a bit. The history of tariffs goes back again to this classical school of economics, because at the point of imperial expansions, this era of so-called mercantilism, right, where the sole purpose of the nation state was to extract and accumulate wealth. Well, what that meant was that some states didn't want to get rid of that wealth, right? So they tried to produce as much as they could in their own country so that the wealth that they were accumulating would stay within the coffers. This is in the context of, when the economy is more or less on the gold standard. And the classical economics, particularly David Ricardo, is the first one that really thinks of this idea that's called competitive advantage or comparative advantage. And for him, the theory is, okay, let's say you have two towns. I'll just keep it on a local level. You have one town in Scotland that's along the coast. You have another town in Scotland that's in the Highlands. He's English, so he's dealing with the UK. the town in the Highlands, right? They have an agricultural sector. They are producing a whole bunch of woolen goods, meats, and cheeses, right? That's what they do. The town that's on the coast, they are fishing. It wouldn't make sense for the town that's in the Highlands to try to develop a fishing industry. They don't have the advantage of being on the coast. The town that's on the coast, they have the advantage of being on the coast. And so what Ricardo says is it's in their mutual interest to focus on what they're good at and trade what they're good at without trying to develop their own, the Highland case, their own fishing industries, or in the coastal case, their own woolen industry. It doesn't make any sense. So when you apply this to a national level, and Ricardo talks about Poland, for instance, he mentions, Poland is really good at this moment growing sugar beets, right? And so it makes sense for the Polish agricultural sector to focus on agriculture, focus on goods that they can export to England, who in return will trade them for manufactured goods. And this is in their comparative advantage. This is sort of the heart of what becomes free market liberalism, right? That you don't want to have tariffs because tariffs will disincentivize Poland, for instance, from trading with Britain. They're not going to want to do it. They don't want to pay extra money just to ship their goods there. And in return, England isn't going to want to pay extra to ship their goods to Poland. And so it's the classical economists who really get the ball rolling on this idea that if you could balance the comparative advantage of the manufacturing of goods, not just on a local national level, but on an international level across countries, then you would have a balanced economy. Then you would have less incentive for warfare. Now, the classical economists, they're operating in the, mostly in the 18th century and in the 19th century, but it doesn't mean that all their policies are adopted, particularly with certain commodities. So things like iron ore, coal, steel production, those massive booming industries of the 19th century, they kind of stay immune from the idea of free trade in the sense that those industries are really invested in military production. Essentially, they're involved in weapons of war, and so countries don't want to let their tariffs go on that. They want to hold on to those resources. So the history of the 19th century, in a sense, is one of free market liberalism kind of inching its way toward, we'll call it hegemony, right? So that by the time we get to the end of World War II, that's when this kind of free market model is really practiced in a sort of all-encompassing way. That is starting to be undone. So now when we're talking about the reintroduction of tariffs, we're looking at countries that are in effect retreating into their own production, right? This is Donald Trump wants to bring production back to the United States, the auto industry, the steel industry, the coal industry, et cetera, back to the US. And how do you do that? Well, you impose tariffs on imports of other goods so that Chinese alternatives are too expensive and Americans don't want to buy the expensive option. The other part of this is questions about supply and demand. For a very long time, since maybe the Great Depression, the emphasis on American economics has been on the supply side. Particularly, I mean, most people know this through the Reagan era, supply side economics, right? Reaganomics was sort of the order of the day. I think what we're starting.
Can you explain that real quick, though?
Yeah. Supply side economics is simply the idea that maintaining the supply of goods is the ideal way to balance the economy, which what that requires is incentivizing business to maintain their supply. So that's why, Ronald Reagan cut a whole bunch of regulations to make the business environment for big business favorable in the United States, right? Most people know that aspect of Reaganomics. And we'll get into more about the different components of Reaganomics, but that's sort of the most important to know. That supply side idea, that supply itself, if we maintain a healthy supply, we create good environment for businesses who are then incentivized to create supply through production. That will balance the economy. That's been the order of the day for a very long time, and what we're seeing now is that sort of coming into question as demand. The demand side of this whole thing is sort of stepping up to an extent. I think that we're living in a time right now where the supply of goods is being kind of what's the right word? Amalgamated into certain big conglomerates, big sectors. Amazon, for example, is sort of the major supplier of a lot of things, just to try to give a popular example. So that a lot of the competition that was supposed to, in a sense, balance the supply side of this stuff is disappearing. So now the question for the Fed is, well, is demand maintaining itself? And it's not. People don't have as much money as they have. They don't have as much purchasing power. And so what you're getting now is the reason why the Fed is even thinking about lowering interest rates is because you lower interest rates when demand slips. Because you want people to buy more. People just aren't buying more in the U.S. right now because they don't have the money to do that. So there's a whole bunch of components here. Yeah, exactly. I'm cramming a lot into the big discussion. This is why it's a 5-class lesson, right? There's a lot to talk about. And the best way to do it is to break it up into the different fields, right? So the classical economists are really those who promote this idea of the invisible hand, of the free market, of the supremacy of supply, right? Say's law is this thing that supply will take care of demand itself. The Austrian school of economics is sort of the next logical response to the classical economists. Then you get someone like John Maynard Keynes and all of his disciples.
Well, can we talk about the Austrian? Because I think that's actually kind of important to talk about. You're talking about the von Mises, right?
Yeah, most people know the Friedrich Hayek as sort of the guy that he is sort of indirectly part of the Austrian school, but most people know him. The Austrian school came into this question about supply and demand and about the market, questions about distribution, consumption, and the effects. And the Austrian school came in and they simply said that there's another important part of the classical school that I didn't mention, and that is Adam Smith is the first to say that value is created by labor, right? This is a labor theory of value. And so it's the Austrians that come in first and they say, okay, but value is a subjective thing. There's no ready-made blueprint to put on value or to put on labor. They create what's called marginal utility. So they articulate the idea of marginal utility. So a good example of marginal utility as it relates to the value of goods is, let's take the example of a burrito. You love burritos and you're like, man, I would do anything for a burrito right now. I'm so hungry. I could eat like 5 of them, right? So you go out and you buy 5 burritos. Now, marginal utility would dictate that you eat the first burrito and you're like, damn, this is exactly what I wanted. This is delicious. I can't believe how good this is. This is the best burrito I ever had in my life. The second burrito, you're eating it and you're like, this is good. Not as good as it was the first bite. You know, I think my stomach was bigger than my eyes. Is that the saying? But it's okay. By the time you get to the third burrito, you're like, I'm sort of sick of burritos right now, but I'm going to keep going and keep eating it. By the time you get to the fourth burrito, you're like, damn, somebody else has got to eat this. I'm done. I'm sick of burritos. That diminishing value is what the Austrians called marginal utility. And they're looking at this classical economists' idea of the labor theory of value, and they're saying there's no like ready set value, right? It diminishes. The value of labor, for instance, diminishes over time. The value of goods diminishes over time, and time is a really important component of this too. They talk a lot about changing over time. In that case, value is not objectively labor. Value is subjective, right? It's contingent. There's a whole bunch of variables that go around it. It's really focused on individualism, because for the Austrians, it's individual choices and individual consumer habits that determine the value of a commodity, not labor. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
And so, they're still thinking, of course, labor has a value. You have to pay a wage, but it depends on who's working, what's their experience, how long are they working for, et cetera, et cetera. Now, keep in mind, from the classical school to the Austrian school, these guys are working strictly from kind of like theoretical models, right? They're not mathematicians. They're not creating equations. They might have some equations in their books, but the equations are strictly theoretical postulates, right? They're sitting in their offices or their desks, and they're just thinking really hard about this question of how do you satiate infinite demand in a world of finite resources. This is what they're thinking about. And it's also important to note that the Austrian school emerges at the same time, roughly the same time, as Marxism, because the Austrians are responding to the same emergence of rampant consumer culture that Marxists are. So in the middle of the 19th century, as industrial capitalism is really kind of starting to turn, there are more commodities being made. There's more goods being made than ever before in history. And so then the question is, well, now we have all these goods. How do we distribute them? And not only that, how do we make sure that we're not overproducing? Not only that, but where does the profit from the increased amount of these goods go? So again, the Austrians are saying, well, you can keep producing as much as you want. People will buy it, right? This is supply creates its own demand. That old classical Say's law idea that the Austrians are still very much a part of. Marx is usually left out of these histories of economics and political economy because, well, capital is, first of all, a critique of political economy. So Marx himself sets himself outside of it. But the other reason is because Marx takes a philosophical framework and then tries to apply it to a critique of political economy. And the economists say, no, you can't do that. We're supposed to be objective. We're supposed to be, looking at this with no ideological presuppositions. And Marx, you're adding your ideology to this, and it makes it invalid. But Marx is adding something to it, and that is a real emphasis on the question of profit. Because again, Marx is looking at the same impoverishment, the same emergence of industrial poverty that the Austrians are looking at, but he's saying that this isn't just the question of individual purchasing habits or subjective value or even opportunity costs, right? This isn't just on the individual. There's something more systemic that's going on, something more sociological. And so Marx really hammers in on this idea of surplus profit, expanding on the Smithian labor theory of value, the classical theory of labor value. So the Austrians and Marx I sort of combined in one, and I think I could do an entire class on Marx, and I sort of intend to, but for this introduction to political economy, it's just going to make up one half of one lecture part, because Marx is in the conversation, but he's sort of marginal in a lot of ways, at least in the popular conversation of political economy. Yeah, does that answer the Chicago school question? There's a whole lot to get into.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, you have a 5-class course, and each one is 2 hours long, so it's 10 hours, and then we're definitely not going to get through 10 hours in the 45 minutes to an hour we're going to spend here. I did have a couple more questions for you, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people don't know the difference, but maybe not the people watching the show right now, but a lot of people that will be listening and watching to this show may not know the difference between a trade deficit and the budget deficit. Can you kind of talk a little bit about trade deficits? Because the one thing that I find interesting about Donald Trump is he wrote a book years ago called The Art of the Deal.
Mm-hmm.
And the way he speaks about political economy is extremely simplistic and transactional.
Mm-hmm.
And this idea about better deals for the United States, a lot of people have small businessman syndrome when it comes to their worldview. And they only see the world kind of through small businessman lenses,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like, I have to have a balanced budget. I'm a responsible employer, things like that. Why would you do that when you're a responsible employer? If you only hire a couple people, you probably know them on a very personal level. And you think that all employers act like you do, right?
Yeah.
So there's something about this idea of deals that really resonates with that kind of mentality. And I think that mentality has grown as this idea that every Uber driver and gig worker is an independent worker, right? The rise of side hustles.
Mm-hmm.
So now a lot of us have small businessman mentality when trying to understand the world. So these ideas about deals can even be bad as far as like, well, if a different person was making a deal, then it would work because of the fact that he's saying this so much and actually doing things and not just saying it. For some people, that's really resonating as well. At least he's doing something. But can you talk a little bit about that? Because I don't think we all understand fully what's going on here when he talks about these quote unquote better deals.
Yeah, I could try to be brief about it, but from my perspective, there's a lot of historical context that goes into this, and this sort of part of the purpose of the class. But I've tried to keep it simple. It's very simple, I think. On the one hand, a budget deficit is something that concerns the money supply. And it was John Maynard Keynes during the Great Depression was sort of the first guy to come in that says monetary policy is important. We can balance supply and demand differentials by having the government intervene and kind of regulate money supply. In other words, what he was seeing during the Great Depression was that people were panicking and they were hoarding their money, or they didn't have money. They were losing their job. And so John Maynard Keynes says, well, if you got off the gold standard is the problem, right? That's limiting how much money you can print. Keynes says, if you get off the gold standard, then this government can inject money into the economy. And you guys have all felt this through stimulus checks. This is what a stimulus check is, essentially. It's injecting money into the consumer's pocket with the understanding that the consumer is going to go out, spend that money on something, and increase demand, right? And that will lead the suppliers to increase supply, et cetera, et cetera. So a budget deficit is when the the fiscal abilities of the government cannot match the demand aspect, or even the supply, really, of the economy itself. There's an imbalance. The government owes too much money. And so it can't kind of regulate that monetary policy in the same way that it could if it had a balanced budget. A trade deficit is when there's an imbalance between trading partners. This can be in terms of like tariffs. I think the big one that I remember, my brother, not my brother, but my dad is sort of a Trump guy, and one that he brought up was that we don't tariff Germany, but Germany tariffs us for over like our cars, Ford and Chevy and yada yada. That according to Trump would be a trade deficit. There's an imbalance in the benefits and costs of trading with Germany, for instance. And so the biggest example of this for the U.S. is China, right?
Don't read the chat.
China is sort of the biggest example of what Donald Trump would say is the is U.S.'s biggest trade deficit. As an imbalance between how much they're supplying to us and how much we are sending to them. So Donald Trump's whole thing is, we want to make an even deal because they're ripping us off, essentially.
And someone asked in the chat, how do you feel about MMT?
What's MMT?
Modern monetary theory.
Oh, yeah. So we'll discuss that a little bit at the end of the class itself. I think that like any attempt to try to provide some kind of empirical understanding to whether it's monetary theory or even just like economic relations whatsoever, I think is sort of not possible. I mean, like if you think about it, as I said, political economy, economics is fundamentally a moral question. It's a sociological question. And so for me, like John Maynard Keynes, he was a mathematician, and one of his big contributions to this whole thing was he said, we have equations that we can apply to understanding, questions of monetary policy or questions of demand or whatever. But the problem is, like, where did you get your numbers from? You sort of just made numbers up. Like you have some surveys that come in through the U.S., but still there's no kind of objective numbers that you can apply. The Chicago School of Economics, they come as a response to Keynes, and they create what's called econometrics, which is like a very rigorous mathematical application to economics. But everybody knows the Chicago economists, I'm assuming, for bad reasons, right? You all know Milton Friedman. You know what happened with his essentially economic experiments in Latin America and such. So even the School of Economics that tried to apply mathematical theories to their postulates, it didn't really work out. So I'm skeptical, but we'll get into it in the end. The last part of the class is going to also talk about climate change, because I think that climate change significantly qualifies this question about supplying finite goods for infinite demand. It changes the sort of game a little bit, and this changes the whole field. So yeah, those things we'll talk about at the end.
What is your take on the idea of a Marxist economist? Is that a real thing, or is that just something people say as a selling point?
Oh man, you're gonna get me in trouble.
That's fine.
You get me in big trouble. I think.
Do you ever do it? Is one a wink once if Richard Wolff is in the room?
I'm gonna state. I mean, I'll state the obvious. I am a Marxist. I would get that on the table. I am a Marxist. But I will say, I fully understand why Marx is usually left out of the conversation on economics, not political economy, on economics. Because, as I said, the subtitle of Capital is a critique of political economy. Marx was taking the sociological or even philosophical aspect of political economy and subjecting it to criticism. So, you know, there are some equations in Capital, yada, yada, but they're just as socially postulate as anybody else's. And Marx kind of also, he took Adam Smith's theory, labor theory of value, but he sort of intensified it and really foregrounded it. But again, like I say, in the realm of economic theory, for me, the real thing that Marx contributed is by centering profit, right? All of these guys are concerned with supply, demand. Some of them are concerned with monetary policy by the time you get to the 20th century. But it was Marx who really foregrounded this question of profit. Where does the profit come from? Where does it go? And how does that contribute to inequality, right? The Austrians and the Chicago guys, they say, well, if you're an entrepreneur and you are making profit, good for you. That's all that matters. We don't care about anything else if that's what you're doing. Keynes would say, if there's one company that's in there making ridiculous amount of profit at the expense of competition, then Keynes would actually say the government should get involved to try to break up this monopoly, in a sense. So, you know, a lot of people, I think, don't have a very good look on Keynes, but he was the guy that I think, in terms of economics, navigated a middle ground between the Austrians, who really emphasized individualism, and the classical economists, who are all about this like free market, invisible hand shit. So, you know, I think Keynes is somebody that, you know, we'll spend a whole class on.
Do you think we can ever get a return to Keynesianism? Kind of New Deal Keynesianism?
I think that is probably the maximum that we will get in the United States as it.
But I asked that seriously. Can we even get that? I mean, we have said on this show several times, you know, even a very little bit of social democracy would go an extremely long way in the United States. We've been cutting those reforms since WW2. So they're kind of whittled down to nothing. And if you see the, you know, the kind of blowout of homelessness, which is just so large, any number you read is a massive, massive understatement, especially when you understand how those numbers are gathered. I think people believe that there's like a homeless census, but it's not. Yeah. It's not what people think it is. So, you know, a very little bit of social democracy would go a long way. How do we even get to where we were 80 years ago?
I think, you know, what I meant by that's the maximum we're going to get is essentially what Anton in the chat said, which is it'll happen before there's any kind of Marxist economy that's achieved. So when you think of people like Bernie Sanders and AOC, right, in the best possible world, I don't know about your listeners or you, but in the best possible world in my lifetime, I would see people like them elected to the role of president, right? Full stop. But I don't see any kind of economic policy that they would advocate wouldn't be a Marxist economy. You know, Bernie Sanders can say that he's a social democrat and stuff, and he is, but at heart, the economic policy that would be reintroduced would be a new kind of Keynesianism that allows a place for government interference or government regulations to sort of help out when market failures occur. And the thing is that, like, right now, or actually as of 1980, the Reagan administration was really the first that applied this like intense supply side Chicago-esque policy, which was non-government interference in the market, which meant that, like, oh, you have unemployment is increasing. That's not the Fed's responsibility. We're not going to react to that at all. It will correct itself eventually. right? Just let these people go unemployed. And that's what happened under Reagan, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, you would hope that with a return of a sort of neo-Keynesianism, there would be more government interference into market failures and things like healthcare. Healthcare is a market failure. Into things like unemployment, the persistent existence of unemployment in the U.S. in the changing labor landscape is turning out to be a major market failure, I think, to which you need interference somehow, at least in my mind,
Mm-hmm.
But I agree with what Anton said. You won't get a Marxist economy. That's
No.
Speaking pragmatically, and it sucks to say because, like I said, I am a Marxist. But I taught today. My class today, we talked about the so-called end of history. I had them read Fukuyama, and
What did they think? What did they think of that book?
they didn't understand it. I had to explain
because of the time has changed so much. They don't understand like there was a Soviet Union. Like, all jokes aside, do you kind of have to explain to students the Soviet Union? Because there was a joke with Americans that they all thought Russia and the Soviet Union were the same place, and a lot of people still do.
Oh yeah, no. It's a world history class. So they were introduced to the Soviet Union like 5 weeks ago.
Okay.
When it emerged, what they didn't understand was like the philosophical understanding of history and time. Right? They didn't understand how Marxists understood history differently than a Hegelian understanding of time, of ideas or whatever. But I brought that up for a reason. I don't remember what it was now. I brought it up for a reason, but I don't remember.
End of history. Just tell. I want to hear the story about you talking to these kids about the end of history now.
It had to do with. I brought it up because we brought up Marx, and I talked about Marx's historical philosophy and the end of history, but I don't remember why now I brought it up. It's related to political economy. Anyway, for your listeners, the lectures are much more structured than me rambling on. Trust me. I'm just, trying to get stuff out here to answer questions. But yeah, I don't think that there'll ever be some kind of like Marxist economy in the United States, but there'll certainly be, I hope, in my lifetime, fingers crossed, a return to some kind of Keynesianism in the sense that the government doesn't feel obliged to not interfere in market failures, because with the reality of anthropogenic climate change, it's pretty clear that like a lot of things now are turning out to be market failures, whether it's healthcare, whether it's energy, whether it's even just the extraction of natural resources and the way that it's done, to the extent that all of these things are contributing to climate change. They can be looked at now as market failures. And not only that, they're market failures that, when it comes to the increased production of plastics and the emissions of pollutants into the air, CO2, how does the market correct that? Right? That's what the Austrians and the Chicago people would say. They say, well, any market failure will be corrected if you just leave it alone. But climate change now is saying there are certain market failures that cannot be just self-corrected. And so that's going to be the heart of the fifth day of the classes. We'll talk a lot about climate change and what it means for this entire economic, political apparatus in history.
There was a conversation we had in the TIR chat about this thing that someone's trying to coin as a new phenomenon. We might do a show about it called doom spending. Have you heard about this?
Doom spending?
Yeah.
No, I haven't. What is it?
It seems pretty ridiculous to me. Let me actually I want to get the exact definition for you because I don't want to paraphrase it and have some doom spender be like, you said it wrong. It's not what it is. Doom spending is not what you said. It's what I said. It's like, well, fucking hold on. I have a slow computer. So, doom spending refers to the phenomenon of impulsively spending money to cope with feelings of stress, anxiety, or pessimism, often about the future or economic conditions. It is a form of retail therapy used to momentarily escape from worries, but it can lead to financial problems in the long run. I think this is ridiculous to put a name to it like it's a brand new thing, because it's been going on since, you're able to buy shit, especially through credit and layaway. But there's a new thing. I shouldn't say a new thing. There's apps now, and there's like things for you where you can check out to be like, hey, you want to buy this Uber Eats? Well, you can go through this service and you can get it now and pay later. You want to get this expensive latte or whatever, you can get it now and pay later. What say you to a growing number of young people opting to buy now and pay later? I think the statistic that was shown was like a big portion of people at Coachella, I forget the number, it's pretty big, maybe it was like 60%, used buy now and pay later to get their tickets, which again, I don't think is strange, because most people got their tickets through credit cards anyway from years before. So this is no different, in my opinion. But what say you to this idea that this is a new money dysmorphia? Somebody said.
I think it is, and I think that, like, the ruling class, if you want to use that phrase, I think that they like this, right? This isn't a bad thing for them, because the emergence of a kind of credit economy is good for business, is good for the economy in general, because it means that, especially when you're not on the gold standard anymore, it means that you could keep printing money, even if you don't really have the economy to do so. It really depends, and there's an economic analysis to be made about the two parties, right? We can say that they're both supply side, more or less, but there's one party that is a little bit more, I would say, supply side. So I don't know. I've noticed the same thing. There's a kind of increase in consumer credit on just like tiny useless things, like you said, on fucking lattes and stuff like that. And on the one hand, I think it's market failure in the sense that it's a fundamental imbalance between demand and supply.
Do you see this comment when Alex was talking about having 5 burritos? My first question was, how do I afford that?
Well, yeah, that's precisely it, right? We're at a point now where, to get back to this question about budget deficits, and to get back to the question about budget deficits, right? The U.S. the government, Congress, whatever, right? They pass a budget deficit every so often, which kind of determines what the amount of money in circulation in the economy is and is going to be. And when most of that goes to a particular industry, I'm not going to say which one, but you know which one it is. That means that the amount of money that's in circulation is, to the average consumer, is limited. Because another big thing that the Keynesians have, another big idea that they contribute to this whole thing, is a sort of sharper idea of the circulation of money. And this is why Keynesians are so obsessed with monetary policy. They have this kind of really great image, which is like, you have a dollar bill, you go and you buy a pack of gum at the store, that dollar bill enters the cash register of the store. The worker at the store takes that dollar bill and turns it into 5 and buys a chocolate bar with it. And that $5 then goes into another company's drawer. That company takes their money at the end of the day, they put it in a bank, and the money like circulates throughout the economy. But what happens when so much of that potential circulation is kind of restricted to a very restricted avenues of either certain industries or certain people, right? Then the question becomes, well, now you have a rampant consumer demand in the sense that Americans want to buy because that's what we've been told to do for the past 50 years since the end of World War II. But we don't have the fiscal ability to do so anymore. Part of that is a result of the supply side economics that, as I said, was intensified under Reagan. The sort of government saying, we don't care. Like, doesn't matter if you're unemployed. You figure it out, and eventually you'll get a job. That's on you to do as your own individual market actor. But again, I think we're just reaching a point where I don't think that the Chicagoists or even the Austrian economists before them could have envisioned the extent to which capital could be hoarded. I think that they're postulates that, like, well, we shouldn't disincentivize entrepreneurs because ultimately they create jobs and the money that they make is going to circulate back into the economy. Like in 1870, that's probably true because the amount of goods that you could buy or what you could do with that money as an entrepreneur is not the same as it is today. It was different, but today it's a lot different. Today you can have banks that are offshore. You can kind of just save a whole bunch of money and buy 15 yachts for yourself and 5 mansions or whatever. You don't have to circulate that money throughout the economy to the extent that like the Keynesians were envisioning. And some people might say, oh, but when they build those yachts or those mansions, they're employing carpenters. The carpenters are getting wood from, this lumber company who's getting their wood from, lumberjacks in Washington or whatever. It's right. But what you have essentially forming is what's called, on the one hand, monopolies, which everyone knows what a monopoly is, and misogyny, right? And misogyny is essentially a monopoly of supply. So these companies like Amazon, Amazon is good at buying up competitive suppliers. So I wouldn't doubt if Jeff Bezos's houses are built by companies that he owns with using raw materials from companies that he owns.
Yep.
You know what I mean?
Agreed. Totally agreed. So is your course anti-Amazon?
I'm always trying to use real world examples to make it, because a lot of this stuff is theoretical. A lot of it is, as I said, Adam Smith sitting in a chair just thinking about, the morality of economics and coming up with this image of a pin that most people know because even Marx used that image. I try to apply it to today. Try to paint pictures for people so that they understand these terms that I'm kind of blowing through right now. But trust me, we spend a lot more time on things like opportunity cost, praxeology, all that stuff we'll really zoom in on. If you're interested.
I want to remind people that wherever you're watching or listening to this episode, there is a link in the description before we even talk about what the show is. There's a link to Alex's course so you can sign up for it. There's a limited number of seats, so definitely move quick. What prompted you to want to do this before we leave? Labor theory of value? Poverty? It was poverty.
So I'm coming for you, dog.
Seriously, what prompted you to want to do this?
There's two things. The first one is that I fundamentally believe that because of what's going on to education right now, whether it's public education or even colleges, it's sort of becoming our collective responsibility to take our education, or at least part of our education, into our own hands. And like, that's easier said than done. So like all of your members in the chat could say, oh, Alex is right, I'm going to sign up for community college. And then you do, and each course that you take is $4,000 or more, minimum $4,000. And it's like, I can't afford that, right? So that's one. I try to make education accessible and also fun. So that's why there's a discussion aspect of it. That being said, there's still a lot of labor that goes into this. Like I said, the classes aren't going to just be me ranting like this. I have to write lectures and I have to create PowerPoints and set up the meetings. I had to scan all of the readings. All the readings are for free, or they're in the drive. So there is a cost, and I tried to make it as low as I possibly could, given the labor that goes into it. The other reason why I wanted to do it is because I'm assuming, because of the name of your podcast and who I know you to be, I'm assuming that most of the listeners and the people who would be interested are, I'm not going to say that they're socialists or communists, but I'm going to say that they're on the left. And if you're on the left, that usually means that you have a materialist understanding of history, materialist conception of history, or a materialist notion of why people act the way they do. And in order to understand that on a world historical scale, you have to understand the fundamentals of how the economy works. And in order to understand that, you have to have the historical context. So John Maynard Keynes, for example, didn't emerge from, thin air. He has a historical context. The classical school, Adam Smith, didn't emerge out of thin air. He has a historical context. The Chicago school, Marxism, Austrians, supply side economics, etc. All of this stuff emerged from very specific historical context that, while we know history doesn't one for one repeat itself, it still rhymes. And so a lot of these words that you brought up, trade deficit, budget deficit, tariffs, etc., all of these words are important to us today. And they have historical precedents and historical roots. And so I think that a general understanding.
You killed your mic, Alex.
And so
Alex. Oh, there you go.
A general understanding of economics is important for people to kind of have an understanding of how the world works, and also to know what the fuck Donald Trump and Jerome Powell are talking about and how it affects you, because it does affect you.
I think that's important. I wish we were older. Well, you weren't alive, in the 80s, but I wish had I been older, I would have tried to do something like this, probably with a ham radio, as there was no internet access like we have it now in the 80s. Alex and I are going to the champagne room, where we're going to continue part of the discussion. I'm also going to show Alex a series of videos that I want him to comment on.
All right, I'm gonna do one last pitch.
Go for it. I'll move out of your way.
I think there's 7 seats left. I'm capping it at 20 because I want people to be able to have a conversation and not have 40 people trying to chime in. So I think there's about 7 seats left. We're still working out the specific day and time. I'm leaving it open, and we're going to decide as a group what day of the week to meet and what time. It's only for 5 weeks. Each session is 2 hours. That amounts to, I think, $10 per class. If there's 5, it's 50 total. And the readings are there for you. Our primary mode of communication is a Telegram channel. So you have to download Telegram so that we can send memes to each other, relevant memes to each other.
Oh, not like the ones me and you send?
Yes, only relevant memes. Relevant memes to each other. But we're gonna start a community. I want to start a community of people who are literate, who can converse about these things and have fun, while also learning, having a good environment as much as we can in the internet sphere. I wish that I could do it in person, but everyone is sort of everywhere. So we'll do the best we can to make it a fun.
And you kind of live in nowhere. Let's just be honest.
What's that?
You live nowhere. Let's just be honest.
That's true. I live nowhere and everywhere. You don't want to come to Providence, Rhode Island.
You know what's funny? There's more people I feel like I know in Providence than anywhere else because of this show. And I tried to hook you up with the guest that I had. Did you guys ever meet up? He wrote about gambling for Jacobin. It's actually a really good article.
No, I don't think we met up.
You're horrible, dude. You're horrible.
I do have some comrades that listen to the show regularly. And actually, the first time I was on the show, one of my favorite comrades, Will, he was like, I heard you on This Is Revolution. He was like, that's amazing. I didn't know you knew Jason. And I was like, I didn't know I knew Jason either. it was cool. It was a cool moment.
That's
anyway.
Funny. Providence was H.P. Lovecraft's hometown. Think about that, Alex.
I've seen his grave. If you come visit, I'll take you to it. That goes for all your listeners, everyone in the comments. Come to Providence, hit me up. Join the political economy course, and then you have my Telegram name. You can hit me up anytime.
Yeah, that was the article. Make sports gambling taboo again. You know what, dude? The sad part about doing this show, I'll end on a sad note before we go in the champagne room, is there's shows that I get hella stoked about because I'm like, oh, this would be a great topic. It's so fucking relevant. And nobody watches.
Yeah.
Nobody watches. Nobody comments. You know, I say one thing about Anna Kasparian, I get 400 comments calling me all kind of names.
Yeah, no, I'm not surprised. Gambling is one of those things that I feel like most people don't want to admit that they do or like have a problem with. You know what I mean?
I think it's changed. It's not the same. You know, we could talk about this in the champagne room if you want, but gambling, when I was a kid in high school, I had a few friends that had bookies. It was still in the shadows, right? And then when we got to be 21, the first thing we did was go to Reno because Reno's like a 3-hour drive for us. And then when we had a little bit more money, we went to Vegas and we gambled. We had fun.
Yeah.
It was an event. But the way that fantasy sports and gambling have combined into this magical thing, you no longer need to be a fan of the sport. You just need to be a fan of games because it's like video games now. And everything is kind of video games now. That's why I think the buy now, pay later thing works because it's on an app. And when your whole life is kind of manipulating screens, then it's more fun to pay that way. It's like buying something from Temu.
Mm-hmm.
I bought one thing from Temu that I use every day that I do this show. It's teleprompter. It's a game changer for me. I love it. That being said, Temu texts me more than anyone else. They ask me how I'm doing. They know when my birthday is. You know what I mean?
How dare you? I text you more than anyone else.
I wish that was true, but you do not. Temu hits me up. Hey Jay, how's your teleprompter? You know, we saw that you looked at a horror movie mug the other day. We know you like horror movies. You like horror movies.
I've never ordered anything from Temu, but I still get ads for it.
Dude, I ordered. So this is how bad it is. And again, I'll be real before this will be on the main show. Temu just keeps texting me. Okay, Temu, okay, let me look. And because they say things like this. They say things like this, like, but perfect for a lonely person like myself. Hey, we were thinking about you. And remember that Hellraiser t-shirt that you looked at? It's $2 right now, Jay. Don't tell anybody, just for you, $2. So you go to this, like, what are you talking about? What did I look at? And you go to the screen, and then this fucking wheel comes up and goes, hey, do you want more money off? Of course I want more money off. Well, then play this game. And you play the game, and you win. I don't even know what I won. I don't know what I won, but I won something. Temu, man. Be careful.
And then your $2 shirt becomes $1.50.
Yeah, it's like, well, look, because you got that shirt, you can get more shirts. Don't you want more horror movie t-shirts? No, I don't. Do you want Steely Dan t-shirts? Yes, I do. We got those too, Jay, because we know all of your information because Spotify sells it. And they don't just sell generic numbers. No. We literally know how you feel during the day.
Yeah, it's crazy.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Yeah. So.
Just before we go, Wonka Bursum, you said that you paid for it. I just want to make sure so that nobody's confused. There's really no other way to set this up. If you go to the Patreon page, if you become a member, that doesn't sign you up for the class. You have to go to shop, and in shop you'll see the introduction to political economy. It says 13 out of 20 right now, $50. You have to pay there. I mean, I recommend people join the Patreon for free. Don't contribute any money to the Patreon. Just join it for free. But you have to pay in the shop for the class itself.
Best comment on the show. I would never gamble. Instead, I invest in cryptocurrency like a sensible adult.
Yeah, I was talking to my students today about cryptocurrency because it is essentially gambling, especially nowadays.
Oh, dude. Yeah. Yeah.
We talk about it in the champagne room.
All right. Look, thank you guys so much for hanging out with us. Alex. Oh, I didn't send you the link to the champagne room, did I?
No, you got to email it.
Okay, I got to email you the link. All right. Thank you guys. The link is already up for the champagne room. If you want to join us in the champagne room, patreon.com/BitterLakePresents. If you're going to forget that, there's a link in the description to join us in the champagne room. That being said, we are out.